Hi everyone, and welcome back to TechInsights, the Chip Observer. Home to all things semiconductor related, covering industry trends, innovations, and key developments. Today we're looking at a story about capacity, how are current demands and world events affecting memory, raw materials, and even your favorite snack packaging. Recently we organized a full webinar on the ongoing capacity crunch and its global effects, hosted by some of our experts, David McQueen, James Sanders, and Mike Walden. This episode walks us through some of the key insights affecting us, going deeper than just the headlines. We're hearing a lot about chip shortages, factories running at full capacity, supply chains under pressure, but really what's going on? If the chip shortage everyone's been talking about isn't actually a shortage at all, then what's happening inside the semiconductor industry right now is affecting everything. The devices you buy, the AI you use, and the global supply chains that power modern businesses.
Talk about one of the most pressing issues today, actually, the capacity issues in the semiconductor supply chain.
So what do most people think the problem is? Most people assume the chip bottleneck is about logic, the processors that run AI workloads, laptops, and smartphones. And there's truth to that. Advanced node utilization at TSMC is running near capacity. But here's where the story gets more nuanced.
Utilization for advanced nodes is running extremely high. So that's around about 90% this year, projected to go up a little, 94% in 2027, I think is the peak there. And what's happening there is not only the mobile SoCs, which are high volume, but then also HPC devices, AI devices are beginning to put further strain on the available capacity.
So what about TSMC's competition? Intel and Samsung. Their ability to pick up overflow capacity at the most advanced nodes matters a lot here.
Intel, Samsung have, as IDMs, they've kind of struggled a little bit, I think it's fair to say, in building up an external customer base for their pure play foundry side of their business. But we have seen some very encouraging signs around 2 nanometer.
And that 2 nanometer breakthrough is significant. Intel shipped first, Samsung quickly followed. And for the first time in years, TSMC has credible competition at the cutting edge.
Intel was first to market with 18A. That was the first 2 nanometer device launch was Panther Lake, which is actually again a mobile SoC, but in this case laptop rather than smartphones. That's Intel using that capacity for its own manufacturing, so acting as an IDM there. But what we've seen since, that we've seen a lot of interest from customers in that process. And I think the successful launch of Panther Lake is a big proof point for Intel that they can deliver a very, very advanced, literally the cutting edge process right now, I would say, in volume, on time.
So what is the real bottleneck? It seems that logic is tight, but that's not the real crisis. The real story is memory.
The real big driver here is the need for HBM memory for those devices.
HBM stands for high bandwidth memory, and the demand for it has turned the entire memory market upside down.
Again, if you just look at the units, it doesn't look like necessarily huge growth in that market.
The thing is that HBM devices have 16 or more layers of them. So the number of units coming out of the factory are not necessarily that high. The wafers required to produce that actually are very high.
The major memory manufacturers are chasing that market very, very hard. And fabs have been re-engineered to serve HBM, basically looking at just under 100% capacity for legacy processes and running at 100% capacity for HBM.
So lead times now for memory are becoming particularly challenging. But what's the catch? Where's the trade-off? Memory manufacturers like SK Hynix, Micron, and Samsung are spending heavily. CapEx is spiking dramatically. But here's the counterintuitive part. That investment isn't easing the crunch. It looks to be making things worse for everything except HBM.
What we have seen, this year, initially, we were projecting that CapEx would be slightly down, and that was from, the company's own financial statements, what they projected their CapEx would be in 2026. It was slightly down. Now there's a massive spike up.
In particular, it seems to have been driven by the likes of SK Hynix, Micron, and Samsung's memory division. They're very quickly re-engineering their fabs as fast as possible to chase that HBM market because there's such demand there.
The kind of interesting side effect of that is that actually that big investment in CapEx is actually exacerbating the capacity crunch when it comes to memory.
And because those fabs that were producing simpler forms of memory are now focused mainly on producing layers for HBM.
So what you're getting there is that the advanced memory, because the fabs are shifting so quickly, that CapEx investment is actually causing less capacity being available for other memory types.
So interestingly, we would normally think if there's more CapEx, there should be more capacity. When actually, unless you're in the market for HBM, then there's less capacity. And that's the net effect of that. At this point, we should pivot a little. Let's take a look at what's being called the DDR4 shockwave. What is it and why does it matter?
You would estimate that there's less than a full quarter of supply remaining in the channel for those memory types.
Of course, for those in the know, DDR4 is the standard memory that powers most servers, PCs, and embedded systems that aren't on cutting-edge chips. And right now, it's nearly impossible to find. The numbers tell a stark story.
If you're in the market for DDR4, this is really a crunch time that you're talking about, perhaps weeks left of availability, which is quite something, to say the least.
The real question to ask here is just how scarce is DDR4 and why? I'll defer to James Sanders to break it down with the actual production numbers.
For mainstream DRAM in 2025, just mainstream DRAM, so that's not HBM, not GDDR, that was 55% of all DRAM shipment. In 2025, DDR4 represented 18% of mainstream DRAM output. So that's 18% of 55%. For 2026, that's shrinking to 5% from memory, I say, as we're speaking of memory.
That really underscores how quickly the supply landscape has shifted. What used to be a broadly supported memory standard is now consolidating fast, with just a handful of players left in volume.
SK Hynix and Micron had already ended DDR4 production by the end of 2025, and Samsung was ending that this year. And so that's why we have Nanya as being really the only volume supplier of DDR4.
So when a critical part just disappears, what happens to the whole industry? Essentially, companies can't just wait. They're forced to upgrade whether they're ready or not. This is happening right now with DDR4, and it's rippling through the entire hardware ecosystem.
There's basically no DDR4 to be had in the market. So that forced upgrade is seemingly an effect. So there's a lot of, older SoCs that you can get on older nodes, but if you can't get the memory to pair with them, the utility of that is not particularly high.
That's a great example of how quickly assumptions can break in this market. What was written off as legacy suddenly became constrained, driving real volatility. Mike, can I ask your opinion on this?
DDR4 was sort of written off, hey, everything's got to go to DDR5 for HBM. And then we saw massive price spikes in DDR4, as James mentioned, because you can't get it. Basically, everybody moved over largely to DDR5. So we have to keep an eye, constant vigilant on all of these moving pieces.
And what does all of this do to prices? The pricing picture is where the divergence between logic and memory becomes really stark. Logic prices have ticked up modestly, but with memory, it's a different story.
Logic, which has historically, like I say, been the biggest part of the market. Okay, there's some pressures happening there. There is some ASP growth. Partly that's driven, in fact, just by the cost of the new advanced processors. That those are, you're was having a discussion about this with one of my team the other day, actually. The kind of cost per processor, cost per transistor is not going down in this generation and hasn't been actually since 3 nanometer.
So when looking at memory, there's pricing pressure where we're seeing it being 3 times the price of what it was a year ago, which is really quite something.
We are going from an historic high to an historic low in terms of the memory market when you look at what's available in the channel today.
So what's the next bottleneck? Once chips are made, they need to be packaged and connected together. That process, called advanced packaging, is quietly becoming the next choke point. Think of it as the assembly line after the factory. And right now, that assembly line is running at full capacity.
Advanced packaging may be a future crunch. So that's driven both, in fact, by more advanced logic devices. So the AI and HPC devices typically using advanced packaging, and even some of the higher volume devices as well.
So demand for advanced packaging, which is largely used by logic ICs, are seeing that capacity just about being met.
An interesting sign that we've seen Intel partnering with Amkor recently. Intel has been one of the bigger providers of advanced packaging. They've got their EMIB and other technologies, but they're clearly at capacity as well and looking for alternative arrangements, partnerships. So we're seeing that demand just about being met. But once that demand from HBM4 starts to come through for higher level, higher layered memory devices, there's a question mark there. Is that going to start to impact the availability of advanced packaging across the entire market and start to put pressure on logic for certain categories of devices like AI and like HPC?
But what if the real risks run even deeper into materials and geopolitics? Beyond capacity and pricing, there's a deeper layer of systemic risk: raw materials. Advanced chips require vastly more chemical inputs than older ones, and those inputs have their own vulnerable supply chains. I'll defer back to Mike Walden to better explain this.
Advanced logic really is a driver for materials. It's using at least 10 times that of its legacy counterparts on an effective wafer basis. So each of those bars exceed 10, with the CMP slurry being exceptionally elevated, approaching 30.
And then there's geopolitics. Tensions in the Middle East are disrupting petrochemical supply routes. That matters because petroleum-based chemicals are essential in chip fabrication, and the pricing signals are already flashing.
The real concern here is that the petroleum-based goods coming out of the Middle East for regions in Asia, for instance, are very comprehensively used during chemical production. And of course, chemicals are industrial, but they also do play a significant role in device fabrication, obviously. The main challenge that we've seen right now is that spot prices for various raw materials, as well as helium gas, for instance, have really what we would consider be the most notable indicator on semiconductor fabrication.
So when considering raw materials, we're looking at things like helium use, for example. Seeing as it's critical for cooling applications within chip etching, we have to ask, how long does the industry have before it becomes a real problem?
At this point in time, we still have ample supply. That is because there happened to be a surplus, a glut, if you will, of helium prior to the situation that occurred with the Iran conflict. We do know that fabricators have supply, not weeks of supply, typically months of supply, with at least a couple indicating to us that they had sufficient supplies through the end of the year. If this is a protracted engagement any further, once we start to run out of production capacity, once we see shipments being strongly curtailed, we would typically say we have about a quarter, 3 to 4 months worth of window to play with before things really start to become dramatic.
Okay, but how does any of this show up in the real world? Here's where the abstract gets wonderfully concrete. James has been tracking an unusual side effect of geopolitical tension in the Strait of Hormuz, one that, at first glance, has nothing to do with semiconductors.
There is a moderate shortage of naphtha in Japan, and Japan refines about 90% of naphtha domestically from raw crude. And just because of issues related to the Strait of Hormuz, that's created some supply shocks in Japan for naphtha.
At this point, I just want to jump in here real quick to give some background on naphtha for those who might not know. It's a petroleum-derived liquid that serves as a key starting material for semiconductors. It's processed into essential chemicals used to make the ultra-pure materials needed to build the actual microchips, as well as other things.
And that's led to a rather different type of packaging issue. So for potato chips in Japan, you'll get packages that are now only black and white because it doesn't rely or is not as intensive for naphtha for ink production. And so I'm looking at shortages of computer and potato chips.
So how does it all fit together? What's the full picture? Let's pull all of this together. David McQueen delivers the synthesis, one clear system story that ties the AI boom, the memory crunch, the pricing shock, advanced packaging pressure, and materials risk into a single coherent picture.
Memory is at capacity, and there's a big crunch here. The CapEx investment counterintuitively may actually exacerbate issues across the memory market for everything other than HBM. And it's translating, unlike other categories, not only into ASP pressure, but to actual shortages as well. So I think some companies are going to have to consider what their alternatives might be.
So the short of it is, yes, logic capacity at advanced nodes is tight, but growing competition at 2 nanometer from Intel and Samsung should help ease that pressure. Looking ahead, advanced packaging and materials could become the next pinch points, with some regional pricing spikes already emerging, but overall supply remains stable, leaving room for continued momentum. And I'm hoping that's the same for the chip industry in Japan. I want to thank our analysts for sharing their thoughts on these ever-evolving innovations. None of this would have been possible without their research notes and insights. Please note, the contents discussed here today were for informational purposes only and don't reflect the views or opinions of the institutions or organizations mentioned. Again, this episode was only a glance at a broader analysis published on our TechInsights platform, both as a report and on-demand webinar. We invite you to visit our site at TechInsights.com and sign up for free to become a guest user and access these complimentary reports and videos. One final quick disclaimer. Although this episode was enhanced using AI, the script, editing, and production were all realized by a real human being human. So, as always, be sure to follow us, subscribe for updates, and explore more in-depth analysis at techinsights.com. Until next time, stay curious, stay connected, and stay insightful.